Hey guys, welcome to the Bourboneering podcast. I'm your host, Austin. Let's get started. So today, I'm talking about rye. It's Rye Month. When I say Rye Month, I mean it is National Rye Month here in the U.S., Rye Whiskey Month. I didn't know about that until about a week ago. I'm recording this in August, releasing this on August 21st. So obviously, if you're listening to it in a different month, it's not Rye Month. But while I'm recording this, when this is first released, it's Rye Month. So I'm going to talk about the history of rye, rye around the world, what makes rye legally a rye, why it's kind of difficult to make a whiskey out of rye, and we're going to do a review of Whistle Pig 6 Year, their piggyback rye. So let's get started. All right. So, like I said, August is National Rye Whiskey Month here in the U.S. September is Bourbon Month. So I'm really excited for that coming up. A lot of cool bourbon episodes coming up. But today, rye. The history of rye. I'm not going to tell you how it got started because we're not really sure. But basically, up until Prohibition, until after Prohibition, rye whiskey was the most prominent whiskey in the U.S. And rye developed first because that's where America was colonized first. In America and Canada, rye was the dominant grain, not corn, maybe wheat, but mainly rye. So rye is what they used to make whiskey. In fact, George Washington owned a distillery, which among other things made what we would call a rye whiskey today. It's because that was the most prominent grain. Now, Kentucky had corn, and so, around the turn of the 19th century, they started making what we'd call bourbon today. But even then, it was kind of localized, regionalized, where corn was grown. Like rye was prominent in the northern states, where most of the whiskey was coming from. It was prominent in Canada, and we'll get to that in a second. It was Prohibition that killed the rye industry, and when it started back up, bourbon kind of took over, or other spirits took over, but in terms of whiskey, bourbon took over, and at least in America, and single malt scotch, of course. So that's kind of, the short history of rye whiskey, kind of some tidbits there. Let's talk about what makes rye a rye. So, legally, in the U.S., a rye whiskey is any whiskey with a mash bill of at least 51% rye. It doesn't have all the other stipulations that bourbon has. Now, if you want to make it a straight rye or a Kentucky straight rye or whatever, it has to follow the same rules as anything else being considered straight or bottled and bond and all that. It can have that. But as far as rye versus bourbon, it's a lot easier to make. It's a lot easier legally to have a rye than to have bourbon. There's a lot less hoops you have to jump through, and that doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be made in the U.S. So Canada has a lot of rye. They're known for their ryes. It is considered a rye whiskey. You may call it Canadian rye whiskey, but it is a rye whiskey here in the U.S. It's not a U.S. only term like bourbon is. So I'll talk about Canada. A lot of rye comes from Canada. They make their own rye. Whistle Pig actually sources their rye. The one, if it's not making it on site, they're sourcing it from Canada. That's actually a Canadian rye, but you don't see Canadian rye on their label. Now, they're transparent about where they get it from. Don't get me wrong. Whistle Pig is doing a great job with that now. But on the bottle, it just says rye whiskey. You don't see Canadian anywhere clearly on the label. And it's not because they're trying to hide it. They're well within their legal right. Now, I want to talk about why rye whiskey. I'm bourboneering. I'm focused on bourbon. Sometimes I talk about scotch. Why rye? I like rye because it tends to be, spicier. That's kind of the stereotypical rye is a spicy note, like a rye bread. And some other notes that I often get out of it are like a spearmint, sometimes even like a candied spearmint. Dill sometimes, which I'm not a huge fan of. And then just like a breadiness, like it almost tastes like a piece of rye toast to me. And it's not like super bready in the usual term of the word, but it tastes like rye bread to me, like a raisin rye toast. And they're really enjoyable because they're very, very unique, each bottle, just like just like bourbons are, but people think of a rye as a general flavor, but they're very vastly different bottle to bottle, just like bourbon tends to be. So I enjoy it. It's great for old fashions and Manhattans, and I'm sure other cocktails, but that's my go-to. Even anywhere from a cheaper rye to a fancy rye, they're great in cocktails, great neat. Use it anywhere you use bourbon. That's what I do. Anyway, that's my little spiel today about rye. It's going to be kind of short. I'm going to get into my review, and we're going to call it a day. All right? Happy National Rye Month. All right, guys. Today I'm reviewing Whistle Pig Piggyback. This is their 6-year-old rye. If you listen to the show, you know I'm a Whistle Pig fanboy, but their bottles can get kind of expensive. I mean, even their 10-year is close to $70 or more in the store regularly. Get into the old world, and the 15-year-old, you're talking hundreds of dollars here. And I think it's just fantastic. But this is kind of their cheaper release, or middle shelf release, I would call it. It's about $40 to $50 depending on where you are. And it's 6 years old. So let's give it a little review here. Now, I'll warn you now, I use this in cocktails all the time, which is kind of their goal. It's a Whistle Pig that bartenders aren't afraid to put in their cocktails. So on the nose here, I get some soapy notes, like almost my favorite note in a Willet rye, which is Dove soap, but not quite as bad as a Willet, or as good. I don't know. I like that note. Definitely spicy, rye spice, if you know what I'm talking about, like a rye bread spice. And a little bit of that dill on the nose. And I'm not a huge fan of the dill. It's not my favorite. But the nose, it's not too complex. It's pretty, flat with those 3 notes. And I think I'm going to give the nose a 2.5. It's average. It's good. I enjoy it, but there's also some notes that I don't like. That brings it down. So on the taste, up front, it tastes like a bourbon. That's what I get. It just tastes like a, kind of a generic bourbon. But then it kind of goes into that candy that I was talking about, the spearmint candy. There's a minty hint there, but it's mainly sugar sweetness. Then it kind of gets a little rye spicy, especially on the back. Oh, and it's pretty long finish. That's pretty good. But even then, it's still simple. I'm not fighting to find any notes. It's just, it is what it is, but it is delicious. And I think it stands out great in a cocktail. I'm gonna give the taste a 3.5. It's kind of impressed me the more I sip on it here. Interesting. And finally, to our value, like I said, depending where you are, it's around $40 to $50. So it's not a cheap bottle, but it's a much cheaper alternative to the $70, $80 Whistle Pig 10, and up from there on that. So I'm gonna give it a 2.5. It's pretty readily available now. It's decent. It's average between the value and what you're getting out of it. It's a good bottle. It's 2.5. All right, so that gives us a score of, let me do some calculating. And our final score overall is 2.8 for the Whistle Pig Piggyback 6-year-old. That's a good score. It's above average. It's a good bottle. I suggest you pick it up. Now, especially if you're into craft cocktails, it is a great rye for cocktails. It's not going to break the bank like you would putting a fancy 10-year-old rye in there. But, it's a better bottle than just getting, a lower shelf Evan Williams and throwing in your cocktail. But that's up to you. If you're just like enjoying a cocktail for a cocktail, get you a cheaper bottle. But if you're getting into the crafting your own, the art of mixology, this is a good bottle to start with, I really believe. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Thanks for enjoying Rye Month with me. Go crack your favorite rye and have a pour. Cheers. Thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure you subscribe on whichever player you're using. Leave a comment and leave a 5-star review if you can. Once you've done that, go follow me on Instagram at Bourboneering, or on Twitter at nbourbon, or go like our Facebook page, Bourboneering. All this, as well as my Prestige Decanter affiliate link, and a link to sign up for a weekly newsletter, are all below. Thanks for listening, everybody. Cheers.